Well, hello and welcome to this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Something happened this week that hasn't happened before. The first sitting Canadian parliamentarian testified before a committee of the US Congress. And the topic, China interference in elections and China intimidation, that we have been talking about now in this country for quite some time. Let's just set the stage. China is an authoritarian, one-party communist state, and I'm going to quote the words of one of our former ambassadors to China, David Mulrooney. We all have a stake in pushing back against a China that uses hostage diplomacy, economic blackmail, and even the threat of execution to achieve its objectives. So we are going now to the man in the center of this whole discussion. Michael Chong, member of parliament since 2004. Is that correct, Michael?
That's right.
Yeah, and a very interesting history. He's one of those people, and I'll say it because he won't, that is respected by both sides in the chamber. His issues that he takes up are serious democratic changes in the House of Commons. So he is respected. So when you say that you have been intimidated by the Chinese government, this is something we need to take very seriously. People have been talking about it, but I want to go back to the beginning. You were sanctioned in 2021 by the Chinese when you started criticizing China on the Uyghur issue. Just give us a bit of context.
Yeah, so in early 2021, I introduced a motion into the House of Commons, which was adopted with votes from members of all parties, recognizing the genocide that is taking place against the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang province in Western China, which is being perpetrated by the government of the People's Republic of China. Subsequent to that, the government of Canada, which the cabinet, which had abstained from that vote, subsequently to that, decided to sanction individual members of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang for committing these human rights abuses. And then the Beijing decided to counter retaliate by sanctioning me for the government's sanctions. So that was the beginning of the story. The sanctions were also applied at the time to a number of US and European politicians as well.
So you knew that had happened, that counter sanction, but in fact, there was other stuff going on behind the scenes that you were not informed about. Potential threats to your family, both here and I believe in Hong Kong as well.
That's right. And the government became aware around that time that a diplomat that they had accredited in Toronto, who was working for the PRC's consulate in Toronto on St. George Street, was actively running around the Greater Toronto area, collecting information about me and my extended family in Hong Kong, and passing that information along to the Ministry of State Security in Beijing for potential further targeting. Or God knows what other ideas they had. And I didn't find out about this till the Globe and Mail reported on this in May of this year, just several months ago.
So the security establishment understood that this was going on. Presumably they informed somebody somewhere along the line in government, just not you.
That's right. Our security service, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, made sure that this information was sent to the various points, as they call it, within the Government of Canada, including the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the National Security Advisor, and a number of other senior officials in the Trudeau government. But no one acted on that information. No one informed me that this was going on, and no one decided to do what should have been done at the time, which was to expel this diplomat from Canada.
Absolutely. I mean, I read today with interest, and this is the latest report from the Elections Commissioner, an annual report to Parliament, that somehow in this report, she has omitted all mention of China in an update on the investigations into alleged election fraud by foreign agents. I find that a bit stunning. What is your gut tell you about why they don't want to talk about this and say it out loud?
It's a good question, Pamela. I am stunned by the naivete of this government. It's inexplicable, particularly after the fact that for years, CSIS has been advising the government that this interference by Beijing in our elections, in our democratic institutions, in targeting Canadians is a serious national security threat. And that it by far and away, Beijing is the largest perpetrator, the largest originator of these threats. And even after all that advice, even after all that intelligence, the government still continues to drag its heels on countering it. To me, is completely inexplicable.
Everybody talks about doing business and keeping trading relationships open, but you can do two things, which is you can carry on some degree of business, perhaps, as I think you mentioned the other day, stop some shipments of slave, created goods. But you can also push back diplomatically and perhaps even legally and say, stop this.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good point. Look, I remember Prime Minister Harper saying this when he was Prime Minister, that the relationship we have with the PRC in trade is in their favor. We have a massive trade imbalance with the PRC. That trade imbalance is in their favor. We buy a lot more from the People's Republic of China than they buy from us. And so in that respect, we have leverage over them. If the opposite was true, we'd be much more vulnerable. So there are various tools in the toolkit that the government of Canada has to defend our interests and our values. And so I think the government needs to be looking at the whole of the relationship. You mentioned the importation of products produced using Uyghur forced labor. That should be a given, that those products should not be coming into Canada. In fact, it's putting our trade relationship with the United States at risk. Mm-hmm. Article 23.6 of the new NAFTA agreement bans the importation of these products into the North American free trade zone. The U.S., since that treaty has come into effect, has interdicted and seized some 2,500 shipments from Western Xinjiang, where they believe that have been produced using forced labor, things like cotton, tomatoes, silicon, solar panels, and yet here in Canada, not a single shipment has been seized. So I think we're at risk of the Americans getting concerned that Canada's become the leaky back door through which these products are flowing into the United States. And so we should be doing a lot better on seizing these shipments from coming into Canada.
Well, and even if we just cast our mind back to the pandemic, I mean, I think we were the only people in the world buying Chinese vaccine and Chinese made masks, most of which we had to throw out because it was junk, it was garbage.
Again, the government of Canada approved, I believe, some intellectual property that was transferred to the People's Republic of China for the development of a new vaccine in the PRC. And when the time came for us to receive doses of that vaccine, the government in Beijing denied the export permit to Canada. Yeah. So again, a very one-sided relationship where, we are constantly, frankly, being a bit of the Boy Scout. And they are taking advantage of us.
That's maybe the kindest way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a difference between a naivete and a willful blindness. And you seem to be giving them the benefit of the doubt at this point that it's more naivete. But as these situations mount up, and as you say, even creating issues with our trading partners, it's a little hard to claim I didn't know about it. I didn't think about it.
Yeah, I think in respect of election interference and the meddling in our parliament, I think there is one has to conclude that there's been willful blindness,
Yeah.
because it in the sum of the things that we know have been reported on, it benefited the Liberal Party of Canada, and I think that's why it was so important that an independent public inquiry be established, because we need to know who knew what, when, and what did they do about it regarding the PRC's interference in our last two elections.
So the government has finally, albeit reluctantly, agreed to this inquiry to kind of get it back on track after the first rather muddled and failed attempt. But now they've broadened it out. So it's not just looking at China, it's looking at Russia and Iran and anything else that might come up. I'm wondering if you think that's a mistake, that what we should just really focus on is this issue where we have evidence and reportage and information from the security establishment, and at least try and sort that out instead of such a broad, brush.
Well, I think it's up to Justice Ho to determine the focus of the inquiry, and I think it's really, really important that she understand and focus on the People's Republic of China, simply because security experts, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, has told us many times over the last several years that the vast majority of foreign interference in Canada is originating from Beijing and not other countries. To be sure, we've had evidence of foreign interference from
Yeah.
countries like Iran, like Russia, but the vast majority is coming from the People's Republic of China. And I'm hopeful that Justice Hogue will keep the focus on the PRC, because that is where the vast majority of the threat is coming from.
We also have a huge Chinese Canadian diaspora population. What are the numbers, would you think, roughly?
Roughly 1.7 million Canadians trace their origins back to China, but just over 4% of our population. And why this is such a national security threat is that the coercion, intimidation, silencing of these Canadians because of Beijing's targeting is ending up with them unable to exercise their charter rights, their fundamental rights to expression, to assembly, to vote, and we cannot tolerate that in a democratic and sovereign country.
Because of the consequences, not only for them here, but for family back at home.
That's right. The PRC's tactics include threatening family back in at home in the PRC. They'll get a knock on the door from the Ministry of State Security, just asking them questions about their family in Canada if they've been outspoken about human rights. The PRC has even gone as far as doing those activities here in Canada. An example of that was in Vancouver just a couple of years ago, where in many cities, like in many cities around the world, pro-democracy activists came together to organize rallies in support of the anti-extradition protests in Hong Kong. And the consulate organized counter-protests where the counter-protesters were verbally threatening physical harm to these activists. That's unacceptable. We've had cases at the University of Toronto and McMaster University where students there arguing and defending human rights of Tibetans and Uyghurs were actively targeted through coordination of the PRC consulate in Toronto. So, that stuff crosses so many lines and has to be shut down, which is why we've called on the government to introduce a foreign agents registry like the UK just did 2 months ago.
Well, and even basic conversations about Taiwan and what our relationship is. I mean, that will be seen as a threat and enough of a provocation to perhaps lead to intimidation back home or here.
That's right. The diplomats, as people probably know, have been engaged in this new style of diplomacy since President Xi assumed power a decade ago, called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they're crossing a lot of lines and openly attacking anyone that is talking about issues that we debate in a free democratic society. Taiwan is another issue, as you pointed out, where Beijing's been quite aggressive in trying to shut down debate.
And it's not long ago that this country was looking at the situation of the two Michaels and Huawei, and somehow, even in the light of that, it wasn't enough to provoke very, very strong action from this government. I know there's always the argument that you're trying to get these two guys out alive, and so you tread gently, but it seemed to be a very slow and constrained process, if I can put it that way.
Oh, absolutely. For the several years that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were wrongfully detained, you could understand that the government was hesitant to take action to defend our interests in other areas. But they were released shortly after the 2021 election 2 years ago. And since then, the government has continued to drag its heels on any action to counter this coercion and intimidation here at home. For example, a foreign agents registry is something that we've long called for. It wasn't until the Globe and Mail's reports of the last year that the government has reluctantly indicated that they are looking at introducing one. And then I read more recently the Prime Minister hedging on whether or not they are actually going to introduce one. So again, every step along the way, they've dragged their heels in taking any meaningful action to counter the threat from Beijing.
I think you've done a very important service by, you can't fix anything till you name it, right? So you've named it, and you're at the center of it. You're not alone. There are other members of parliament that have been intimidated as well, Jenny Kwan and some others that are out there. But then I think you've kind of risen to this occasion and said, okay, let's start to fix it. So the foreign registry that we've been talking about now, it exists. Australia is just setting up a new one. There are lots of templates for this, so it's not very complicated. And the real bad operatives aren't going to sign up anyway. I mean, we do know that, but at least we'd have some list of who's here and what they allege they're doing, even though they may be doing other things behind closed doors.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I think the utility of a registry is for those people who don't sign up. In other words, if you are acting as a clandestine, covert, secret agent of Beijing, going to Canadians, trying to coerce them, for example, to go back to the PRC for further intimidation, and you haven't registered under this registry, that allows for a criminal prosecution, which is how the tool has been used in other countries. And look, there are plenty of experts that have called for this. In fact, Michael Wernick, the former clerk of the Privy Council, just several months ago said Canada needs to adopt one. And frankly, he said, look, we should get on with it. I don't know what the delay is. He said, my recommendation, as I recall from his testimony to committee, was just to cut and paste the UK bill that was recently adopted in July of this past summer. So, it's something that we need to do because it's clear we don't have all the tools we need to counter PRC agents here in Canada intimidating Canadians.
And we don't need any newer special rules to stop shipments of slave-produced goods. I mean, that's against the rules now, right?
That's exactly right. Article 23.6 of the new NAFTA requires the three signatories, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, to ban these products. And we adopted legislation shortly after that treaty was ratified to bring that into effect. The problem is that the CBSA has yet to operationalize it, and this is where I think allied democracies can
border security.
The border folks, and I think this is where allied democracies can work more closely together. The Canadian government should be learning from best practices in other jurisdictions like the United States and how to ban these products, to stop these products, seize these products from coming into Canada.
What would it take? Because one of the issues that certainly came up in your testimony, but has been live throughout this, is how do we oblige governments, knowing that this is a national security risk, to make some of these things public, to come and knock on your door and say, you may not know this, but this is going on, and then to make the further decision to state that publicly so that you, other political figures, other Canadians of Chinese descent might get their antenna up and be a little more sensitive to this. Do we need a law that says you've got to tell the person that's being intimidated?
I don't think we need a law, but I think you raise an excellent point, which is that experts have been telling us for years that foreign interference is a serious threat and that it can't always be countered through a criminal prosecution,
Right.
that it can't always be countered through legal action of government, because a lot of the intelligence gathered doesn't rise to the evidentiary standard of a criminal prosecution in a court of law. And in those cases, the advice is to be transparent and to use sunlight to reveal to the public the details of these foreign activities here on Canadian soil, so that the public is equipped and armed to defend themselves and to insulate themselves from these activities. So, I think the two things that need to happen in Ottawa is we need a culture change within the government of Canada, where the whole of government understands that they have to be more open and transparent with the public about what exactly is going on. And secondly, I think the government should learn from best practices in other jurisdictions, such as the United Kingdom, which has been going public with these threats. Just two cases in the UK Parliament. A year ago, Christine Lee was identified as a PRC agent, and all MPs were informed by the Speaker because of the intelligence from MI5. More recently, just in the past week, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak told the public that there was a second PRC agent that had been arrested in the UK Parliament and his employment terminated. So I think we need a lot more of that here as well, and follow best practices in other countries.
Well, it's just struck me as we're sitting here, like even with the Paul Bernardo case, for God's sake, give the families a heads up that you're transferring him and putting him somewhere else, and that, maybe don't do that on the anniversary of one of the tragedies. Like it really is an issue on these questions, as you say, of transparency and openness. It costs nothing. And it gives people a sense that their system, their institutions are working for them.
Absolutely. And look, this is part of there's a broader issue with transparency in Ottawa. The Information Commissioner has long been critical of our information disclosure, but this is critically important in the area of national security and foreign interference.
One of your U.S. questioners the other day, one of the congressmen said, and he was quite worked up about this, and he said, "Yeah, okay, well, they're going to continue to mess with us, and so we'll mess with you." He was pretty direct in this, but underneath he does raise a really good point. Should we be messing with them? Should we be not just pushing back and exposing the diplomats, quote unquote, that are engaged in this, but doing our own counter propaganda measures using technology and trying to break through their walls that they use to keep the Chinese public ignorant?
Well, I think that I'm not sure we should provoke the PRC. They are the world's second largest superpower. But I do think we should be taking lessons from the past and learning from them. One of the things that we did during the Second World War, one of the things we did during the Cold War, was we tried to educate the publics of behind the Iron Curtain in authority, during the Second World War in totalitarian states about news and information. And we used shortwave radio to broadcast news and media into those countries so that people could be informed about what was actually going on. In this day and age, with the Great Firewall around China, uh, it's much more difficult to do. And with the demise of shortwave radio, it's much
Yes,
more
right.
difficult to do. But there are VPN technologies, virtual private network technologies that can be developed, that can be used to get that information to a public that is often completely closed off from
Yeah.
what's going on in the real world. And I think that's where Western governments should put efforts into making sure that that's available to the public of countries like China.
You expressed particular concern the other day about the use of students who are more vulnerable than a politician such as yourself, that once you get this information, you at least have a stage on which to discuss it and share it. But if you're a young Chinese student over here and they're threatening your family at home, uh, you're going to be more likely to cooperate or help them out because you're fearful, because you have no choice.
Yeah, there's evidence that that Beijing is coaching the Chinese international students at our leading universities who are here on student visas, who often have scholarships from
Right.
back home in the People's Republic of China, who obviously have family back home
Yep.
in China, and coaching them into participating in foreign interference threat activities on university campuses. And so we have to make it clear that that's unacceptable. And we have to denounce it when we see and hear it, because it not only is unfair to the students that are being targeted, such as Kemi Lau, who was
Yep.
elected president of the University of Toronto Scarborough Student Council, and who was targeted for speaking up in favor of Tibetan human rights. It's also unfair to these international students who are being used as pawns in Beijing's belligerence.
But that is a group you can also offer up counter propaganda and information and facts, because they will find ways to communicate with their friends and families.
Absolutely, and I think when we've had international students attending our universities for decades,
Yeah.
for well over, for maybe even a century or more. When we started to receive students from behind the Iron Curtain in the 1970s and 80s, governments took it as an opportunity to show them what open Western democratic societies were all about. And so many of the student associations that were presently on campus that now are being used by Beijing to further its threat activities were actually established decades ago to help students integrate into campus life, to get them to see the broader Canadian and Western society, and to expose them to Western democratic ideals. And so I think we've got to, university administrators should be putting efforts into making sure that those student associations, those Chinese student associations, play that role rather than the role that Beijing wants them to play.
Yeah. And then we also have to put our money where our mouth is and make sure that we're supporting free speech and open debate in this country. It is also, in my mind, under threat.
Agreed.
Just one other question on that particular point, which is we also know that a lot of universities in this country and a lot of the scientific and medical research that goes on is funded by China. And so that makes it difficult as well. I mean, we can use the Winnipeg lab story, but just more basically, universities, they get to charge foreign students a big whack of money to come, more than they do domestic studies. And there are pro-China groups on almost every campus.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point you raise. We have got to sort out with our closest allies how governments fund university research. I think, look, the People's Republic of China is not the Soviet Union. During the time of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was, there were two systems in the global order at the time. There was the Soviet system, and then there was the Western Alliance. And never the twain did meet. We didn't have much people to people ties between the two systems. We didn't have any trade or investment, and there was very little research collaboration between the two systems. That's not the case today. China is an integrated part of the global economy. The research they produce and the research we produce is, broad and deep. And that should continue. But I think in sensitive areas of research, we should heed the advice of our security service, which has said that China is a threat to our national security, a threat to theft of that intellectual property. And that's in the 5 areas of quantum computing, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean technology, and telecommunications. And in those areas, we should not be funding research in partnership with any PRC entities. I think the other area that should be completely off limits is research collaboration with China's military. And so we've got to put in place policies to ensure the protection of our research in those areas. And I think collaborating with governments in Europe, in the United States, Australia, the UK on how to do that, I think is critically important, because it is a large research ecosystem that just isn't confined to Canada. And I think we need to work with our allies on that.
Well, and I also find it offensive when ministers like Minister Guilbeault go to China and criticize Canadian companies standing on the ground of a country that's the largest polluter in the world. While we criticize our own companies for not doing enough, it makes you shake your head.
Absolutely. I think a decade or more ago, one could have taken the leadership in Beijing at their word when they said they were serious about combating climate change and that they would work with OECD countries to reduce emissions. I don't think you can say that anymore. I think it's clear in the last several years that Beijing is bent on massively increasing their emissions. In fact, they have accelerated the approval of coal-fired electricity plants in just the last 12 months. They're now burning more coal than they ever have. They plan to burn even more. In fact, China today burns more coal than the rest of the world combined, much of it to produce electricity. And 1/5 of the world's emissions come from coal-fired electricity plants. And so, for Minister Guilbeault to go over there and to participate in a Beijing-led environmental climate change council and land Canada's good international name and reputation to give Beijing cover for this massive plan to increase emissions is beyond the pale. And I think that's why we call on him to step aside from that.
Yeah, for sure. A final quick point that you raised in testimony, as did they, which is in parallel to all of this is sort of the corruption that goes on, and you talked about Canada's naivete, and we're kind of an easy place for money laundering as well, running it through casinos or whatever it may be, even universities, as to our earlier discussion here. This is very troubling.
It is very troubling. Foreign interference in Canada often takes place alongside corruption. Often takes place with payments, vast sums of money that are flowing into Canada that are the proceeds of kleptocracy and theft abroad. In fact, the Cullen Commission in British Columbia concluded that there was a lot of international money laundering coming through BC real estate, particularly from the People's Republic of China, and that those resources, those funds, are being used by those close to the government in Beijing to intimidate and coerce Canadians. And so we need to crack down on that stuff. The State Department estimated in last year's report, or the year before, that money laundering in Canada is $100 billion a year affair. That's equivalent to about 5% of our GDP.
Oh, it's staggering.
And so, this is why we've long called for a beneficial ownership registry. The government has belatedly introduced one. The problem with it is that it only covers federal corporations. And, there's 4.3 million companies in Canada. Only about 10% of them are incorporated under federal law. 90% are incorporated under provincial law. provinces are introducing similar registries, but not all of them cover trusts and real estate. And there's evidence that real estate's a big part of the problem. So we need to get our legislative and regulatory rules in place that cover all the loopholes. And we need to start tracking and tracing this stuff and prosecuting individuals for doing these, washing this kind of money.
Michael, I want to thank you very much for your clarity on this, your calmness. This is, I think as one of your colleagues said about you, you're not the guy that barks at every car that goes by. You you pick your issues, you're well informed, and you've made the case. And I think you did us proud by making the case stateside to one of our most important allies on this. So good luck. We'll be watching. I'm sure we'll talk again about this issue, and I'll just say I hope you and your family stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Michael. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you again soon.